The first bullet tore through the canvas tent at dawn, and Samuel Harper's coffee cup shattered in his hand. Blood mixed with hot liquid as he dove for cover, dragging his youngest son beneath the wooden table while gunfire erupted across the ravine. Outside, men were screaming, not the shouts of warning or commands to take position, but the raw animal sounds of men dying in the dirt. The Harper camp, nestled in the narrow Kentucky Valley where they'd struck gold just 3 weeks prior, had become a killing field before the sun cleared the ridgeline. Samuel pressed his palm against his son's mouth, feeling the boy's terrified breath hot against his skin, knowing that everything they'd worked for, everything they'd sacrificed to claim this land, was being stolen in a storm of lead and fury. Where are you listening from? And what would you do if armed men attacked your family's claim at sunrise? Write your answer in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more real mining stories that will shock you. 3 weeks earlier, Samuel Harper had stood on this same ground with nothing but hope and a worn surveyor's map his grandfather had drawn in 1876. The old man had prospected these Kentucky hills during the tail end of the Western Gold Rush, when desperate men turned eastward, convinced that Appalachian streams held secrets the California miners had overlooked. His grandfather never found his fortune, dying broke in a Cincinnati boarding house with that map folded in his Bible. Samuel inherited both, along with a stubborn belief that the Harper bloodline was meant for more than sharecropping tobacco on land they'd never own. The winter of 1924 had been brutal across Kentucky. Coal mines were closing, farms were failing, and the economic desperation that would fully bloom into the Depression was already casting its shadow across rural communities. Samuel had gathered his 3 brothers, Thomas, William, and Joseph, along with their sons, and proposed what the family women called madness. They would liquidate everything they had, pool their resources, and stake a claim in the remote valleys of eastern Kentucky, where his grandfather's map indicated a promising creek bed. "You're chasing a dead man's dream," Samuel's wife Margaret had said, her hands twisted in her apron as she watched him pack. "We have a roof over our heads, Samuel. The children have a school to attend. What happens when you find nothing but rocks and regret?" Samuel had kissed her forehead, tasting the salt of her tears. "Then we'll have tried, Maggie. We'll have tried for something more than watching our children inherit our poverty." 15 Harpers, 4 brothers and their eldest sons, ranging from 47-year-old Samuel down to his nephew David, barely 16, had made the journey into the backcountry with 2 mules, camping equipment, and mining tools purchased on credit they had no clear way to repay. The terrain was unforgiving, steep ridges covered in dense forest where creeks cut channels through ancient rock. They followed the map to a valley locals called Devil's Hollow, named for the way wind howled through the narrow passage during storms. For 2 weeks, they found nothing but fool's gold and false hope. The younger men grew restless, talking about heading back before they burned through their supplies. Thomas Harper, the eldest brother, had already started calculating how much debt they'd accumulated for this failed venture. Then David, scouting upstream while the others worked a played-out section of the creek, had come running back to camp with his hands cupped around something that caught the afternoon light like captured sunshine. "Uncle Samuel," the boy had gasped, breathless from his sprint down the rocky slope. "Uncle Samuel, I think I found it. I think I really found it." The nugget in David's palm was unmistakable. True gold, roughly the size of a robin's egg, its weight and color proof against any doubt. Samuel had felt his heart hammer against his ribs as he examined it, then looked at the faces of his brothers and nephews gathered around. Every eye held the same desperate hunger, the same wild hope that their lives were about to transform. They staked their claim that evening, marking the boundaries with wooden posts and registering it with the county office in the nearest town, a struggling settlement called Harker's Ridge, 20 miles down rough mountain roads. The clerk, a thin man named Whitmore with ink-stained fingers and suspicious eyes, had studied their paperwork with unusual interest. "Devil's Hollow, you say?" Whitmore had repeated, writing slowly. "That's disputed territory. The Gaines family has historical claims to portions of that valley." "Historical claims aren't legal claims," Thomas Harper had countered. "We checked the records. That land is open for staking." Whitmore had shrugged, stamping their documents with a thud that seemed too loud in the small office. "Just warning you, the Gaines clan doesn't take kindly to newcomers, especially newcomers finding what they believe belongs to them by right of blood." Samuel had dismissed the warning as small-town politics. The Harpers were law-abiding men filing legitimate claims. They had paperwork, witnesses, and rights that even mountain feuds had to respect. He'd been wrong about that, fatally wrong, and now that mistake was being paid for in blood as bullets continued to tear through their camp in the grey dawn light. The shooting lasted 4 minutes, though it felt like hours. When silence finally fell, broken only by moaning and the sound of boots crunching over broken equipment. Samuel cautiously raised his head. The tent canvas hung in tatters, morning light streaming through dozens of bullet holes that created a constellation of deadly stars. His son Daniel, only 14, stared up at him with eyes too wide, his body trembling with shock. "Stay down," Samuel whispered. "Don't move, don't make a sound." Through a tear in the canvas, he could see the camp in ruins. William lay motionless near the fire pit, his body twisted at an angle that told Samuel his younger brother was gone. Joseph was crawling toward cover, leaving a trail of blood from a leg wound. Thomas had made it behind their supply wagon, returning fire with the old Winchester they'd brought for hunting, but Samuel could hear the distinct click of an empty chamber as his brother pulled the trigger again and again. The attackers moved through the camp with practiced efficiency, 15 or 20 men in dark clothing, their faces covered with bandanas. They overturned equipment, smashed their sluice boxes, and gathered anything of value. One man, taller than the others with a commanding presence that marked him as the leader, stood in the center of the destroyed camp and pulled down his bandana, revealing a weathered face with cold blue eyes. "I'm Luther Gaines," the man announced, his voice carrying across the valley with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is Gaines' land, has been for 3 generations. You Harpers had your warning at the county office. You chose not to listen." Samuel felt rage boiling up through his fear. He'd glimpsed William's body, his brother's blood soaking into Kentucky soil, and the injustice of it, the senseless, murderous injustice, made his hands shake. But he had Daniel pressed against him, his son's life depending on Samuel's next decisions, and revenge was a luxury for men who didn't have children's lives in their hands. Thomas emerged from behind the wagon, his rifle empty but his spine straight, walking toward Luther Gaines with his hands visible but not raised in surrender. Samuel's older brother had always been the diplomatic one, the peacemaker, but there was steel in Thomas now, a hardness born from seeing his younger brother murdered. "We filed legal claims," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the carnage around them. "Whatever dispute your family has, this isn't the way to settle it. You've killed an unarmed man, wounded others. There are laws even out here." Luther Gaines spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Laws are for cities and courtrooms, Harper. Out here we have different ways. Your grandfather tried to take what was ours 50 years ago. We drove him off then, and we'll drive you off now. Difference is, this time we're making sure you understand the message. The difference is, you're a murderer," Thomas said quietly, "and murderers hang, even in Kentucky." The sound of Luther Gaines's laughter was like stones rattling in a can. "By whose authority? The sheriff in Harker's Ridge? That's my cousin. The judge in the county seat? He owes my family money. You're strangers here, Harper. Nobody knows you. Nobody will miss you, and nobody will ask too many questions when we say you trespassed on our land and forced our hand." Samuel watched this exchange through the torn canvas, his mind racing through possibilities and finding no good options. They were outgunned, wounded, isolated in a valley controlled by a clan that had just demonstrated they were willing to kill to protect what they considered theirs. Running might save some of them, but would leave others behind. Fighting would get them all killed. Surrendering meant trusting the mercy of men who'd opened fire on sleeping families. Joseph, still bleeding from his leg wound, called out from where he'd dragged himself behind a rock. "We found gold, Gaines. Real gold, more than a few nuggets. That's what this is about, isn't it? You knew it was here. You've always known, but you couldn't find it yourselves. Now we've done your prospecting for you, and you want to take it all." Luther Gaines's expression didn't change, but Samuel saw several of his men exchange glances. There it was, the confirmation they needed. This wasn't just about territorial claims or family feuds. The Gaines clan had suspected gold in Devil's Hollow for years, but lacked either the skill or resources to locate it. The Harpers had succeeded where they'd failed, and rather than stake their own claim or negotiate partnership, Luther Gaines had chosen theft and murder. "The gold is ours," Luther said simply. "Always has been. You're just temporary trespassers who found something that belongs to my family. Now, you have a choice. You can walk away right now with whatever you can carry and whoever can walk. Leave the gold, leave your equipment, leave this valley and never come back. Or you can keep arguing about rights and laws while we finish what we started." Thomas Harper stood silent for a long moment, and Samuel could see his brother calculating, weighing the worth of pride against the value of lives. They'd lost William. Joseph might die from his wounds if they didn't get him to a doctor soon. Samuel's own hand was bleeding steadily from the bullet graze when his coffee cup shattered. How many other wounded did they have? How many more would die if Thomas chose defiance over retreat? "Give us 1 hour, Thomas finally said. 1 hour to gather our wounded, bury our dead and pack what we can carry. Then we'll leave and you'll have your valley." Luther Gaines nodded slowly. 30 minutes. "And Harper, if I ever see any of you in this county again, I won't offer choices. I'll just finish what we started here today. The next 30 minutes moved with the surreal, nightmarish quality of events, too terrible to feel entirely real. Samuel emerged from the tent with Daniel, finding that 6 Harpers were wounded. One, William, was dead, and the youngest boys had miraculously escaped injury by hiding in the forest when the shooting started. They wrapped William's body in canvas with shaking hands, Thomas saying prayers in a voice that kept breaking. Joseph's leg wound was bad, the bullet having shattered bone, and they fashioned a crude stretcher to carry him. The Gaines men watched everything with rifles ready, occasionally checking their pocket watches to ensure the Harpers kept to the agreed timeline. Samuel moved through the destroyed camp in a daze, grabbing medical supplies, food, blankets, anything essential for survival. Their mining equipment lay smashed beyond repair. The gold they'd found over 3 weeks of backbreaking work had vanished, scooped up by Luther Gaines's men, who'd clearly known exactly where to look. As they prepared to leave, young David approached Samuel, his face pale, but his jaw set with the same stubborn determination that ran through Harper blood. "We can't just leave, Uncle Samuel. They murdered Uncle William. They're stealing our claim. If we run now, they win everything." Samuel looked at his nephew, seeing William's features in the boy's face, and felt something break inside his chest. "They've already won, David. They won the moment they fired the first shot, because they were willing to do what we weren't. Kill for gold. Maybe that makes them stronger, or maybe it just makes them monsters. But either way, we can't beat them. Not today. Not like this. So we just give up? We go home with nothing but debt and death?" Samuel put his bleeding hand on David's shoulder, feeling the boy tremble with rage and grief. "We go home alive. We bury your father with honor. We heal our wounds. And then we decide what justice looks like for the Harper family." They left Devil's Hollow in a ragged procession, carrying their wounded and their dead, stripped of equipment and dignity, but still breathing. Luther Gaines and his men watched them go, making no move to help or hinder, their rifles still ready in case the Harpers changed their minds about leaving peacefully. The last thing Samuel saw as they rounded the bend in the valley was one of the Gaines men already setting up a sluice box where the Harpers had been working, preparing to extract gold from a claim that existed on paper but had been stolen at gunpoint. The journey back to Harker's Ridge took all day, their pace slowed by wounded men and rough terrain. They buried William in a clearing overlooking the valley where he died, marking his grave with stones and Thomas's broken-voiced prayers. Joseph's condition worsened as they traveled, his legs swollen and infected, his fever rising despite their efforts to keep him cool and hydrated. By the time they reached Harker's Ridge at dusk, he was delirious, calling for his wife and children between bouts of trembling. The town's doctor, an elderly physician named Holloway, who'd seen plenty of mining injuries in his time, examined Joseph with practiced hands and a grim expression. "The leg's badly infected. I can try to save it, but his chances aren't good. He needs a real hospital, not a frontier clinic. There's one in Lexington, but that's 2 days hard travel, and I'm not sure he'd survive the journey." Samuel, Thomas, and the other Harpers gathered in the doctor's small office, their faces haggard with exhaustion and grief. They'd started this venture with dreams of prosperity, 15 strong men ready to claim their fortune. Now one brother was dead, another was dying, and their dream had become a nightmare of violence and loss. "Do what you can for him," Thomas said quietly. "And send someone for the sheriff. We have murders to report." Dr. Holloway exchanged a glance with his assistant, a young woman who'd been cleaning Joseph's wound. "The sheriff is, well, you should know that Sheriff Gaines is Luther's younger brother. I'm not sure you'll find much help in that direction." The words hung in the small room like a death sentence. Samuel felt the last fragments of hope crumbling away. They'd filed legal claims and followed every rule, and it had meant nothing. The Gaines family controlled the law, controlled the land, and controlled the narrative. Outsiders who came seeking fortune in their territory could be murdered with impunity because who would investigate, who would prosecute, and who would testify against a clan that had roots deeper than any law? Thomas slammed his fist against the wall, the impact sending a framed diploma trembling. There has to be someone. A federal marshal, a state investigator, somebody who isn't in Luther Gaines's pocket. "There might be," Dr. Holloway said slowly, his tone suggesting he was choosing his words carefully. "There's a federal agent in Louisville, fellow named Carson. He's been investigating illegal mining operations and claim jumping in eastern Kentucky. Word is he's actually honest, doesn't care about local politics or family connections. If you could get word to him, explain what happened." "How long would that take?" Samuel asked. "How long before a federal agent could investigate a claim-jumping case in a remote valley?" "Weeks, maybe months. These things move slowly, and the federal government doesn't prioritize mining disputes in Kentucky. Samuel looked at his brothers and nephews, seeing the same calculation in every face. Joseph might not survive weeks. The Gaines family would have months to extract every ounce of gold from the claim and erase any evidence of the Harpers' legal stake. By the time a federal agent arrived, there would be nothing left to investigate except conflicting stories and a valley controlled by the clan that had always owned it. David spoke up from the corner where he'd been sitting silently. "So we do nothing? Uncle William is dead, Uncle Joseph is dying, and the men who did this just get away with it? What would you have us do?" Thomas shot back, his voice raw. "Storm back into that valley with our wounded and our empty rifles? Get the rest of us killed for a pride that won't bring William back or save Joseph?" "I'd have us fight," David said, standing up with his hands clenched into fists. "I'd have us show them that the Harper family doesn't run scared, that there's a price for murdering us and stealing from us." Samuel understood the anger in his nephew's voice because he felt it too, burning in his gut like acid. But anger without strategy was just another word for suicide, and he'd already buried one brother today. The weight of leadership, of being responsible for the lives of frightened, wounded men and the families waiting for them back home, settled over Samuel like iron chains. Whatever choices he made now would define not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone who'd followed him into these mountains. Dr. Holloway worked through the night trying to save Joseph's leg. Samuel and Thomas took turns sitting with their brother, wiping his fever sweat and listening to his confused rambling. Sometimes Joseph thought he was back on the farm, calling out instructions for planting tobacco. Sometimes he was a child again, crying for their mother. And sometimes, in his clearer moments, he recognized his brothers and asked the question they couldn't answer. Was it worth it? Did we get the gold? Thomas lied to him, saying yes, they'd secured their fortune and everything would be fine. Samuel couldn't bring himself to speak at all, just held Joseph's hand and felt the fever heat radiating from his brother's skin. Near dawn, Joseph's breathing became labored, his chest hitching with wet, struggling sounds. Dr. Holloway checked his pulse and shook his head slightly, a gesture that needed no translation. Joseph Harper died as the sun rose over Harker's Ridge, 2 days after the attack in Devil's Hollow. The infection had spread too far, his body too weakened by shock and blood loss to fight it. They'd lost 2 brothers to Luther Gaines's greed in less than 48 hours, and the survivors gathered in the doctor's office with a new weight in their eyes, the look of men who'd crossed a line and couldn't find their way back. "We bury him next to William," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "We take the rest of our family home, and then we decide whether we're the kind of men who let this stand." They held the funeral that afternoon in the clearing overlooking Devil's Hollow, laying Joseph beside his younger brother, with rough carved markers that would weather away long before the grief did. A few townspeople attended, showing respect, but keeping their distance, clearly aware that associating with the Harpers might bring Gaines' family displeasure. Samuel spoke the eulogy this time, his words simple because grief had burned away anything elaborate. "Joseph and William came to Kentucky believing in possibility," Samuel said, standing between the fresh graves. "They believed that honest work and legal claims would be enough. They believed that in America, even poor men could stake their future and build something better for their children. They were wrong about that, at least here, at least now, but they weren't wrong to believe it. And we're not wrong to remember them as men who died chasing a dream that should have been possible." After the funeral, the Harpers gathered at a boarding house in Harker's Ridge to make their decision. They'd lost 2 of 4 brothers and spent every cent they had on this failed venture. Going home meant returning to poverty, debt, and the knowledge that William and Joseph had died for nothing. But staying meant confronting a criminal clan protected by corrupt local law, facing odds that were already impossible and had just gotten worse with their numbers reduced and their will shaken. Thomas spoke first. "I want justice for our brothers. I want Luther Gaines to answer for what he did. But I also have a wife and 3 daughters waiting for me, and they need their father alive more than they need revenge." Samuel nodded slowly. "I have Margaret and 5 children. Daniel saw things no boy should see. I brought them here. I led this venture, and the responsibility for William and Joseph's deaths is mine to carry. But Thomas is right. We have families depending on us." The younger men shifted uncomfortably. David, William's son, spoke with barely controlled rage. "So we just go home? Tell everyone that the Harpers are cowards who run when men steal from them?" "Courage isn't dying stupid," Thomas snapped. "Courage is knowing when you're beaten and having the strength to walk away." "Walking away means they win everything," David countered. "The gold, the land, and the satisfaction of knowing they can murder us without consequence." What kind of men does that make us? Samuel understood both sides because he felt torn between them himself. The practical man in him, the father and husband, knew that returning to their families alive was the only sane choice. But the part of him that had held William's body and watched Joseph die from an infected wound wanted nothing more than to return to Devil's Hollow with guns blazing and burn the Gaines operation to the ground. Consequences be damned. There might be another way, said a voice from the doorway. They turned to see a man in his 30s, well dressed by local standards, with sharp eyes and a journalist's notebook tucked under his arm. My name is Robert Mitchell. I write for the Lexington Herald. I've been investigating the Gaines family's activities for 6 months, documenting illegal claim jumping, intimidation, and violence. Your story could be the one that finally brings them down. Samuel studied the journalist with caution. And what good does a newspaper story do for dead men? Mitchell entered the room, his expression earnest. Public pressure, federal attention. The Gaines family operates in shadows, using local corruption to protect their crimes. But sunlight is a powerful disinfectant. If I can document what happened to you, with witnesses, testimony, evidence of their pattern of violence, I can create enough outrage that federal authorities will have to intervene. It won't be quick, but it might be justice. Might be, Thomas repeated bitterly. Might be isn't enough to bring back William and Joseph. No, it's not, Mitchell agreed. Nothing will bring them back. But you can prevent the next family from suffering the same fate. You can make their deaths mean something. Samuel felt the weight of this new choice settling over him. Mitchell was offering them a path between revenge and retreat. Slower, uncertain, but potentially more effective than either extreme. If they testified, if they gave this journalist everything he needed to build a case against the Gaines family, they might accomplish what violence couldn't. But it would mean staying in Kentucky longer, reliving the trauma, and putting themselves in the spotlight as witnesses against a powerful criminal clan. What do you need from us? Samuel finally asked. Over the next week, Robert Mitchell documented everything. He interviewed each Harper family member, recording their testimonies with meticulous detail. He photographed their wounds, copied their legal claim documents, and traveled to Devil's Hollow to document the destroyed camp and the fresh graves. The Gaines men watching their former claim didn't interfere with the journalist, perhaps underestimating the power of words against their guns, or perhaps confident that their local protection extended to controlling any narrative that emerged. Mitchell also uncovered a pattern that made the Harper case part of something larger. The Gaines family had been systematically driving prospectors from eastern Kentucky for decades, using violence and intimidation to maintain control over mineral-rich territories they claimed by historical right but didn't legally own. At least 4 other families had suffered attacks similar to what happened to the Harpers, though none had resulted in deaths before now. The escalation to murder suggested Luther Gaines was either becoming more desperate or more confident, neither of which boded well for future prospectors. The article Mitchell wrote for the Lexington Herald, published 2 weeks after the attack, was devastating in its detail and scope. The Harper clan gold rush that turned into a massacre, read the headline, and the story beneath it laid out not just what happened to one family, but the entire corrupt system that enabled it. Mitchell named Luther Gaines, Sheriff Gaines, and specific local officials who'd turned blind eyes to criminal activity in exchange for Gaines family money and influence. The public response was immediate and fierce. Newspapers across Kentucky picked up the story. Church groups organized protests. Reform politicians found a cause to champion, and most importantly, the U.S. Department of Justice opened a federal investigation into illegal mining operations and corrupt law enforcement in eastern Kentucky. But the Gaines family's response was also immediate. 2 days after the article published, someone set fire to Robert Mitchell's office in Lexington, destroying his notes and records. The journalist survived only because he'd been working late elsewhere that night. A week later, the boarding house where the Harpers were staying in Harker's Ridge received threatening letters, crude notes, promising that talking to newspapers had consequences. Samuel gathered his family for another decision. The federal investigation was underway, but it would take months. They'd accomplished what Mitchell hoped, bringing sunlight to the Gaines family's crimes. But staying in Kentucky meant living under constant threat, watching over their shoulders, wondering if every stranger was an assassin Luther Gaines had sent. "We've done what we can," Thomas said during this meeting, his voice weary. "We've told our story, given the authorities everything they need. William and Joseph's deaths are in the record now. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it's time to go home and let others finish this fight." David, who'd aged years in the past month, shook his head. "If we leave now, we make it easier for them to dismiss us. We become ghosts. Stories people stop believing because we're not here to confirm them. The investigation needs us present." needs us visible. The investigation needs us alive, Samuel countered. And every day we stay here is another day someone might try to make sure we're not. They compromised, as families do when unanimity proves impossible. Thomas and the older men with larger families returned home, carrying with them the bodies of William and Joseph for proper burial in family plots. Samuel stayed with the younger men, including David, serving as witnesses available to federal investigators and living proof that the Harpers hadn't been intimidated into silence. The federal investigation moved with bureaucratic slowness that felt almost cruel given the urgency of their situation. Agent Carson, the honest federal investigator Dr. Holloway had mentioned, arrived 6 weeks after the attack. He was a methodical man in his 50s who'd seen enough frontier corruption to be skeptical of local authorities, but careful enough not to accuse without proof. He interviewed the Harpers multiple times, each session pulling details from their memories of that terrible dawn when bullets tore through their camp. Carson also investigated the Gaines operation directly, visiting Devil's Hollow with federal authority that local law enforcement couldn't easily dismiss. He found evidence of extensive mining activity, documented the presence of equipment and workers, and noted the absence of any legal claim documentation for the Gaines family. Most tellingly, he discovered that the gold being extracted matched samples the Harpers had registered with the county office, suggesting the Gaines clan was profiting from the very strike William and Joseph had died protecting. But building a federal case required more than evidence. It required witnesses willing to testify in court, and that's where the investigation began to falter. Other families who'd been victimized by the Gaines clan refused to come forward, terrified of retaliation. Local officials claimed ignorance or provided alibis for Luther Gaines and his men, and without multiple witnesses corroborating a pattern of criminal behavior, the federal case began to look like a he-said, she-said dispute between one family and another, exactly what the Gaines clan wanted. "We need more," Agent Carson told Samuel during a meeting 3 months after the attack. "Your testimony is compelling, but you're the complainants, which makes you biased in the eyes of a jury. I need testimony from neutral parties, people who witnessed Gaines family violence but weren't directly involved." "Everyone in this county is afraid," Samuel said. "Luther Gaines has made it clear what happens to people who cross him. Then we need to make it clear what happens to people who commit murder," Carson replied. "But I can't do that without witnesses who will stand up in court." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Holloway, the physician who'd tried to save Joseph, approached Samuel one evening at the boarding house. The doctor looked older than when they'd first met, worn down by conscience and complicity. "I've treated 37 patients in the past decade for injuries caused by Gaines family violence," Holloway said quietly. "I documented every case, kept detailed notes, even when I was told to list the injuries as accidents or falls. I've been a coward, afraid to speak up because I need my practice to survive, and speaking against the Gaines family means losing most of my patients and possibly my life. But I can't stay silent anymore. Your brothers died in my care, and I've carried that weight every day since. If Agent Carson needs a witness, I'll testify to everything I know." Holloway's willingness to come forward created a cascade. Other townspeople, emboldened by the doctor's courage, began sharing their own stories of Gaines family intimidation and violence. A store owner described being forced to extend credit he knew would never be repaid. A widow spoke about her husband's suspicious death after he'd filed a mining claim near Gaines territory. Even some of Luther's own men, offered immunity in exchange for testimony, began cooperating with the federal investigation. The case that Agent Carson built over the following months was comprehensive and damning. It documented decades of criminal activity, corrupt law enforcement, and systematic intimidation of anyone who challenged Gaines family control over eastern Kentucky's mineral resources. The attack on the Harper family wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a pattern, and the escalation to murder represented a line crossed that even sympathetic local officials couldn't ignore. The federal indictments came down in late spring of 1925, almost a year after the attack. Luther Gaines and 14 of his associates were charged with murder, attempted murder, theft, fraud, and conspiracy. Sheriff Gaines was charged with corruption and obstruction of justice. Several local officials were also named in the indictments for their roles in enabling and protecting the criminal operation. The trial, held in federal court in Lexington to ensure an impartial jury, lasted 3 weeks. Samuel testified for 2 days, walking the court through every detail of that terrible morning when bullets shattered his coffee cup and his brother's life. David testified about finding his father's body and being forced to leave him in an unmarked grave in Devil's Hollow. Dr. Holloway presented his medical records documenting the pattern of violence, and Agent Carson methodically laid out the evidence of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for decades. Luther Gaines's defense was simple. He claimed the Harpers had trespassed on his family's land and fired first, forcing him to respond in self-defense. His attorneys argued that this was a territorial dispute between competing claimants, not a criminal enterprise. They painted the Harpers as outsiders, trying to steal what rightfully belonged to a Kentucky family with deep historical roots. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. The ballistics showed that the Harper camp had been shot from multiple directions in a coordinated attack, not a defensive response to aggression. The medical evidence documented that William Harper had been shot in the back while fleeing, Joseph while unarmed and clearly wounded. And the testimony from former Gaines associates revealed the planning that had gone into the attack, the deliberate decision to use violence to drive the Harpers away. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. Luther Gaines was sentenced to life imprisonment for 2 counts of murder and multiple lesser charges. His associates received sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. Sheriff Gaines lost his position and received a 5-year sentence for corruption. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, spoke about the importance of equal justice and the rule of law, saying that frontier justice and family feuds could not be tolerated in modern America. Samuel sat in the courtroom as the verdicts were read, feeling a complex mixture of relief, grief, and exhaustion. Justice had been done, or as close to it as the legal system could provide. Luther Gaines would spend the rest of his life in prison, unable to hurt any more families seeking their fortunes in Kentucky's hills. But William and Joseph were still gone, buried in that hillside overlooking Devil's Hollow, and no verdict could bring them back. After the trial, Agent Carson arranged for the Harper family's original claim to be legally restored. The gold extracted by the Gaines operation during the months they'd controlled the site was estimated and valued, and the Harper family received compensation, not the fortune they'd dreamed of, but enough to pay off their debts and provide some financial security for William and Joseph's widows and children. Samuel returned to Devil's Hollow one final time before leaving Kentucky. The valley looked different now, peaceful in the summer sunlight, with no echo of gunfire or screams. He stood at the graves where they'd buried his brothers, properly marked now with carved headstones paid for from the compensation money. Thomas had returned for this final visit, along with David and several of the younger Harper men who'd survived the attack. Was it worth it? Thomas asked, the same question Joseph had asked in his fever dreams. All of this for some gold we'll never properly mine. Samuel considered his answer carefully. They'd lost 2 brothers and nearly lost themselves in pursuit of prosperity, but they'd also exposed a criminal operation, brought justice to a corrupt system, and proven that even poor men with no connections could stand up to power and win if they were willing to pay the price. William and Joseph died believing in something, Samuel finally said. They died believing that honest work and legal rights meant something, that America's promises weren't just for the rich and powerful. Maybe they were naive, but they weren't wrong, and in the end we proved them right. Luther Gaines is in prison. The Gaines family's criminal empire is broken. Future prospectors in these hills won't face what we faced. That's worth something. David placed flowers on his father's grave, then stood up with tears on his cheeks. I used to think courage meant fighting, meant never backing down no matter what. But watching you and Uncle Thomas make the hard choices, choosing strategy over revenge, justice over violence, that took more courage than I had. Uncle William and my father would be proud of what we accomplished. They held a small ceremony at the graveside, saying prayers and sharing memories of William and Joseph before they'd become martyrs to a cause, remembering them as brothers, fathers, and friends who'd laughed at bad jokes and worked hard every day of their lives. Then the Harper family left Devil's Hollow for the last time, walking away from the valley that had promised them fortune and delivered tragedy, but ultimately given them something more valuable than gold, proof that justice could prevail even against overwhelming odds. The story of the Harper family became famous in Kentucky and beyond, written about in newspapers and eventually incorporated into histories of the mining frontier. Robert Mitchell's articles won journalism awards, and Agent Carson used the case as a model for investigating other corrupt mining operations across Appalachia. Dr. Holloway's courage inspired other local witnesses to come forward in subsequent investigations, breaking the code of silence that had protected criminal enterprises for generations. The gold in Devil's Hollow was eventually extracted by a legitimate mining company that that purchased the Harper claim for a fair price. Samuel used his share to buy a farm outright, no mortgages or debts, naming it the William and Joseph Harper Homestead in honor of his brothers. Thomas retired from farming to work with Agent Carson, using his experience to help other families navigate claim disputes and recognize the warning signs of violent intimidation. David Harper, who'd been 16 when the attack destroyed his innocence, grew up to become a mining engineer and advocate for miners' rights. He spent his career helping prospectors file proper claims and teaching them how to recognize and report intimidation tactics. He never forgot the lessons learned in Devil's Hollow, that courage sometimes means walking away to fight another day, that justice requires patience and witnesses willing to speak truth to power, and that the cost of pursuing dreams can be measured in blood, but also in lives saved and systems changed. Years later, when David's own children asked him about the family history, about the gold rush that turned into a massacre, he would take them to Devil's Hollow and show them the graves of the grandfather and uncle they'd never known. He would tell them the full story, not just the violence and loss, but the persistence and courage that followed, the long fight for justice that ultimately prevailed. Your grandfather and great-uncle died for gold they never got to spend, David would tell his children, but their deaths weren't wasted, because they exposed evil that needed exposing and started a fight that needed fighting. They were ordinary men who faced extraordinary circumstances with courage and principle. That's the Harper legacy, not wealth or fame, but the willingness to stand up for what's right, even when the cost is everything. The final chapter of the Harper family story came decades later, in 1967, when Samuel Harper died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 90. His obituary, published in newspapers across Kentucky, told the story of the gold rush that became a massacre, but also of the justice that followed. It mentioned his decades of advocacy for miners' rights, his work with federal investigators to clean up corruption in eastern Kentucky, and his quiet, steady leadership of a family that had survived tragedy and transformed it into purpose. At Samuel's funeral, attended by hundreds, including several federal judges and the now retired Agent Carson, David Harper spoke the eulogy. He talked about his uncle's courage, his wisdom, and his unwavering belief that even the poorest families deserved justice and dignity. He told the story of that terrible dawn in 1924 when Samuel's coffee cup shattered in his hand and his brother's blood soaked Kentucky soil. But he also told the story of what came after, the long, hard work of seeking justice through law rather than revenge, of building cases and changing systems rather than just changing graves. My Uncle Samuel taught us that real courage isn't about being unafraid, David said to the assembled mourners. It's about being terrified, but doing what needs to be done anyway. It's about choosing the harder right over the easier wrong. It's about understanding that some fights can't be won with guns, but they can be won with persistence, truth, and witnesses willing to stand up and speak. The Harper family's gold rush that turned into a massacre became a cautionary tale about greed and violence, but also an inspiring story about justice and perseverance. It reminded people that the frontier wasn't just a place of opportunity. It was a testing ground where character was forged and principles were proved or abandoned. The Harpers had been tested in the most terrible way possible, and they'd emerged not wealthy, but victorious in the ways that mattered most. Devil's Hollow eventually became a historical site, protected by the state of Kentucky as a reminder of the price of corruption and the power of ordinary people seeking justice. Markers tell the story of the 1924 attack, the trial that followed, and the reforms that emerged from the tragedy. Visitors can see the graves of William and Joseph Harper, maintained by the state and regularly visited by descendants who come to remember the family members who died pursuing the American dream but left a legacy more valuable than gold. Samuel Harper's great-grandson, speaking at the historical site's dedication in 1998, perhaps said it best. The Harper clan didn't find the fortune they sought in these hills. What they found instead was proof that justice matters, that ordinary people can stand against power and corruption, and that sacrifices made in pursuit of what's right are never wasted. That's the real gold in this valley, not the metal in the streams, but the truth that even in our darkest moments we can choose to be better than our circumstances demand, and that choice echoes through generations. The Harper family's fight for justice shook Kentucky to its core, but their story wasn't the only mining tragedy that demanded a reckoning. Just 27 years earlier, in the cold, dark mountains of West Virginia, another group of miners faced a choice that would change everything: bow to the company that killed their brothers, or rise up and take what the law refused to give them. 1897, West Virginia, the Hollow Creek miners' revolt that terrified the town. When 19-year-old Thomas Mercer pulled his father's broken body from a collapsed mine shaft, a shaft the company knew was unsafe, he made a decision that would ignite a rebellion. 23 miners, armed with nothing but pickaxes and righteous fury, stormed the company office at dawn and delivered an ultimatum that would either save their lives or end them. What happened next became the most terrifying workers' uprising in Appalachian history, a battle between men with nothing left to lose and a corporation that owned everything, including the law. Click now to hear the full story of the Hollow Creek Revolt, where desperation met courage and the sound of splitting wood changed an entire town forever. You won't believe how it ends.